remote village nestled between towering mountains, Edward and Sophia Hart, along with their young daughter Emma, decided to move into an old, dilapidated house that overlooked an abandoned cemetery. After years of struggle in the crowded city, overwhelmed by financial troubles and family crises, they decided it was time for a fresh start. The village seemed like a peaceful haven, far from the noise and pressures of city life, a place where the family could regain their balance. Edward had found an advertisement for the house at an alarmingly low price, which seemed suspicious, but he convinced himself it was just a stroke of good luck. He told Sophia that life in the countryside would be better for them and for Emma, especially since Emma had been suffering from recurring nightmares in the city. The couple believed that the tranquility of nature would help heal their troubled souls. On the day the family set foot in the village, they noticed the local villagers with pale faces and eyes full of fear. They warned Edward and Sophia against living there. They spoke of curses and voices that came from the cemetery at night, of shadows that moved through the house, and of a window that had witnessed unspeakable horrors. But Edward, with his practical mind and desire to dismiss superstitions, insisted that these stories were merely the product of isolation and old traditions. To him, the house was an opportunity he couldn't pass up, a way to escape the past. On the day the family entered the house, the air seemed to grow colder and heavier. The wind howled around the place like the voices of trapped spirits, and the trees surrounding the house swayed with bare branches, creating a scene reminiscent of an eternal funeral. The house itself seemed like an angry entity, waiting for the right moment to reveal its teeth and consume its new occupants on the first night. While Sophia was quietly arranging the rooms with a cautious tension, she noticed the large living room window that directly overlooked the abandoned cemetery. The thick fog that covered the graves was no ordinary mist. It appeared to move slowly, crawling like a living entity, extending its limbs toward the house, pulsating with malevolent intent. Sophia hesitated for a moment before approaching the window to draw the curtains, feeling an inexplicable shiver of fear surge through her body. As she carefully pulled the fabric, she heard a faint sound behind her, almost like a sinister whisper. "Will you leave the window open for me?" Frozen in place, Sophia's eyes widened in terror. She quickly turned, but the room was empty, and the wind outside was the only sound filling the silence. Her heart raced violently, and her breath became shallow, as if the air in the room had turned dense, charged with something invisible. She convinced herself it was just fatigue and exhaustion, but a dark feeling crept deep within her. The house felt like it was watching her. The walls seemed to hide dark secrets waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. With each passing night, the terror grew, as if the house itself were breathing darkness. Behind the large window, new ghosts began to appear, one after another. Some stood in complete silence, their empty eyes staring relentlessly, while others slowly approached, tapping on the glass in a synchronized rhythm, like the very pulse of death. On one dark night, Emma's scream pierced the eerie silence. She stood in her doorway, her face pale, her eyes flooded with tears. She said in a trembling voice, filled with fear, "The person in the window wants me to come outside with him." Sophia froze in place, while Edward rushed toward the window. But he saw nothing but the thick fog's shadows. However, there was no mistaking the chilling feeling that something was waiting behind the glass. Things in the house began to move in unnatural ways, as if unseen forces were playing with them. Chairs would shift positions at night, doors would open and slam shut loudly, and faint footsteps echoed through the empty halls. Each time they neared the window, the air grew heavier, and a foul, decaying odor filled the air, as though something dead was slowly awakening from a deep slumber. This was no longer a home. It was a dark trap surrounded by merciless forces. After a long and terrifying investigation, Edward and Sophia uncovered the horrific truth. The cemetery that their house overlooked was not a resting place for the dead, but a site for dark, satanic rituals performed for centuries. The victims, who were abducted from nearby villages, were forced to stand before that cursed window. There, they were compelled to look directly at their own open graves, while dark incantations were read over their heads. The terror reached its peak when the victims were buried alive, their screams merging with the incantations of the sorcerers, their bodies trembling beneath the earth, and their torn souls clinging to the place, unable to leave. The window that overlooked the cemetery was not just a window. It was a gateway between life and death, between the physical world and the underworld. These vengeful spirits never found peace. Their empty eyes, which appeared behind the glass, carried an indescribable pain and a burning desire for revenge. Every knock on the glass, every shadow that appeared, was a call for vengeance, an attempt to drag Edward, Sophia, and their daughter into the same horrific fate. The air in the house was filled with poisoned whispers, and the voices repeated cryptic words in a language they did not understand, but it carried promises of eternal horror. Their discovery was not salvation, but an announcement of the beginning of an even darker nightmare. As Edward and Sophia hurried to gather their belongings, an instinctive sense of danger crept deep into them, as if the house itself refused to let them leave. From afar, the ghosts began to move between the tombstones in the cemetery, their movements synchronized like an army of nightmares, slowly advancing towards the house. The large window began to shake violently, the sound of the glass rattling like muffled screams. Suddenly, with one final shake, the window shattered into a black void, a dark portal as if it were the mouth of another world. From the darkness, long, thin hands appeared, their skin rotten and decayed, slowly reaching out as if searching for a victim. In a lightning moment, those hands penetrated the portal and reached toward Emma, who stood frozen in the corner of the room. The child screamed, her voice tearing through the silence. Edward and Sophia rushed toward her in a desperate attempt to save her. Sophia grabbed Emma's small hand, while Edward tried to pull her body forcefully. But the decayed hands were more than just physical strength. They carried the weight of hundreds of vengeful souls. A coldness like ice swept over their hands, and terrifying whispering voices filled the room. "She's ours. You will not escape." Despite their screams and attempts, the hands slowly dragged Emma toward the black portal. The child's eyes filled with terror as she screamed. But in the end, her small body disappeared into the darkness. The portal suddenly slammed shut with a horrifying sound, leaving the room submerged in deadly silence. Sophia collapsed to the floor, while Edward stood in shock, his eyes fixed on the open window overlooking the cemetery, where the shadows moved faintly, as if celebrating the arrival of a new guest. The next morning, the villagers discovered the house abandoned, with no trace of Edward, Sophia, or Emma. Everything inside was calm, as if nothing had happened, except for the large window, which had become the center of terror. On the glass surface, bloody handprints were randomly stamped, as though someone had desperately tried to cling to it from the inside. But the most horrifying thing was the face of little Emma, which clearly appeared on the window. Her features were horribly distorted. Her eyes were as empty as the blackness of night, and a twisted smile froze on her face, holding a mix of innocence and deadly malice. Inside the house, no trace of the couple was found, but the room was saturated with a heavy smell of decay, and the walls bore deep scratches as if something had tried to escape or resist. Beside the window, there was a small notebook covered in dust and blood, on which Edward had written his last words in shaky handwriting. "They take us one by one. The window is not a window. It is the eye of hell." Edward and Sophia, in the end, became disfigured ghosts, appearing with Emma behind the glass. Their faces were entirely distorted, their eyes lost in the void, and their expressions a blend of terror and regret. Their clothes were torn, and their skin was as pale as ash. Their limbs appeared elongated, covered with decayed, ghostly hands, as if supernatural forces were holding them back, pulling them into an endless loop. Their voices were whispers, echoing as if they were about to utter words that had never been heard, yet their eyes told the entire story. It is said that the villagers heard screams coming from the house on that final night, followed by a horrifying silence no one dared to interrupt. Since then, the window has become a symbol of absolute evil. Rumors say the window still overlooks the cemetery, but the glass reflects more than it should. Anyone who looks at it at night is said to see their own shadow slowly transform into distorted features, and sometimes they see other faces staring at them from within, inviting them to approach. As for Edward and Sophia, they were never found, but some swear they saw the ghost of a man and woman staring from the window beside Emma, their faces desperate, their hands pounding the glass as if they were trying to escape. The house now stands as a dark relic, waiting for new visitors, and its open window always smiles. In a remote village, there was an old farm known among the people to be cursed, especially its cellar, buried beneath the ground amidst the remnants of years of ruin and dust. The cellar told a tragic story. Decades ago, it had burned down completely, taking everyone inside with it. It was said that their spirits were still trapped there, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to come near. Marie was a young adventurer with a passion for horror stories, always looking for new challenges. When she heard about the cellar in the abandoned farm, an irresistible curiosity drove her to discover the truth for herself. She took a flashlight and some equipment and headed to the farm at night, ignoring the warnings of the villagers who tried to dissuade her from going. Marie entered the farm and found the rusty cellar door. It seemed as though it hadn't been opened in years. She pushed it open with difficulty, and a foul smell filled the air, a mixture of smoke, ash, and death. With every step she took downward, she felt an increasing warmth, even though the night was cold. When she reached the depth of the cellar, her flashlight began to dim gradually, and the surrounding walls appeared charred, with layers of ash covering the ground. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand grasp her wrist, and when she turned, she saw a pale figure with a charred body staring at her with empty eyes and a terrifying smile stretched across its face. She backed away in horror, hearing screams rising from every corner, like the voices of burning people crying for help in vain. The heat intensified rapidly, and a faint red glow started emanating from the ground as if fire was rising beneath her feet. The ground began to crack, releasing thick black smoke that trapped her and made it hard to breathe. The cellar erupted with invisible flames. Marie felt her sweat pouring down as her body burned from the inside, as if the fire was trying to consume her. Suddenly, more charred specters emerged from the walls, some moving slowly towards her, others crawling along the ground. Their bodies were burnt and smeared with black, muttering mysterious words as if they were casting an ancient curse. She tried to escape toward the stairs, but found the door tightly shut behind her. The screams grew louder, and she felt the walls themselves igniting, glowing with a faint blaze, filling the place with thick black smoke. One of the ghosts approached her, raised its hand towards her, and she felt her skin burning, as if the fire had transferred to her just from its touch. Marie felt an unprecedented terror. Suddenly, her breathing halted, and something heavy pressed on her chest, pushing her down as if the ground itself was trying to swallow her. The voices of the spirits drew nearer, filling the cellar with loud cries like the calls of the dead. She ran in a desperate attempt to find an exit, but it seemed as though the cellar grew deeper, and the ground beneath her was turning to fire. The heat became unbearable, as if she were standing in the heart of a blazing inferno. She found herself surrounded by a web of moving shadows watching her from between the ruins, twisting and dancing around her. In the middle of choking smoke, she began to see terrifying scenes. Charred faces screaming and writhing in pain, wide, lifeless eyes staring at her, and smiles twisted into demonic grins, as if they delighted in seeing her suffer. As she approached the wall, trying to find an exit, she saw burned faces emerging from the walls, staring at her with empty eyes, as if demanding her to stay with them in that abandoned basement. Among these faces appeared the image of a woman wearing burned clothes, crying black tears, and whispering in a despairing voice, "We burned here. You will burn too. This is your end." At that moment, she realized that the basement had no intention of letting her leave, and she had become trapped in a cycle of torment, just like everyone who had burned within its walls. She began to feel her own body heat rising gradually, her hands turning a charred black. She felt as though an invisible flame was consuming her heart. Mary felt herself weakening, as if something was slowly pulling her soul away. In her final moments, she understood that she would never return to the world of the living. At that moment, a vision appeared to her of her body burning slowly, and she began to realize that this was the end. She no longer felt her body, but instead saw everything as if she had become part of the basement, as if she had joined those burned souls who would never know peace. When the villagers discovered her disappearance, the story of the basement turned into a new legend, told on dark nights, adding to the number of those who enter the basement and never return. The burned souls continued to trap more victims, becoming a part of the burning basement.